Thank you, Bob, for joining us at this hot seat. We're going to talk a little bit about payment aggregation and the complexities around that with connectivity. Strategic Treasurer does many different surveys, and this is based on our 2013 and 15 Strategic Treasurer and Bottom Line survey on cash forecasting and visibility. And what I want to point out here is this second bar graph here on payments is that companies are going to spend, and you see this growth from 2013 to 15 from 22% to 31%. They're spending more in the payments arena internally in their organizations and trying to vamp that up and make improvements on that process. So we're talking about payments today. I wanted to show you a little bit about, from our surveys, what people are doing out in the marketplace today.
So when it comes to payments, just to really add on to the point that you were making in terms of there is more money being spent on payments, workflows within Treasury, but also across the entire organization. One of those reasons, unfortunately, is because of this threat of fraud and cybercrime, and we see it all the time. It's unfortunate we have to talk about it, Stephanie, but the fact is it is a reality, and it is something that requires additional investment. That's one driver for why you saw the previous graph increasing quite significantly between 2013 and 2015. Now, the other aspect is because we're actually seeing more of a trend, and part of it is simplicity, part of it is standardization to avoid some of the threats of fraud and cybercrime, and part of it is just looking for greater efficiency in payments, and that's where we see this particular diagram coming into play. What this diagram shows, there's a lot of different things going on here, so I'll try and kind of go piece by piece before we get into more Q&A and discussion. But very simply, what we're looking at is that Treasury is part of the payment universe. Across the entire organization, Treasury initiates payments, you have AP, you sometimes have payroll, there's a lot of different payments going out the door, and what we've found, and this is probably one of the biggest issues, is that where you have a lack of standardization. You have different processes, different systems, different controls, and what that's created is kind of exposure points that can be exploited as well as inefficiency. When I say inefficiency, what we're trying to do is have this entire middle part of the diagram try to be very standardized in as few systems as possible. Now, reasons are quite obvious. Again, it comes back to control, it comes back to visibility and transparency, and it comes back to standardization for all those reasons, such as reducing fraud and increasing efficiency. Now, one trend that we've seen, and I say a trend that we're seeing here in North America, it's more of an evolving trend. In Europe, this has been something that's been commonplace for many, many years. And it's this convergence of Treasury as well as these other payment workflows. And that's what we're representing on this side of the diagram, is the fact that Treasury doesn't need to be on its own island. Now, here in the US, we've typically seen Treasury has Treasury payments, and those are initiated through Treasury system, maybe through the bank portal, but through some different means that's very different than what the ERP has been doing.
Right.
And so the ERP may have some or all of these payments that are in light blue in the diagram. And the reason behind that is because bank connectivity is relatively simple in the US. Different animal when we talk about overseas in Europe and in Asia, but in the US historically it's been fairly simple. That said, it's also been a bit inefficient and it's exposed to additional risk. And that's why you're starting to see this convergence, whereas there are ways to bring everything together in one payment hub, which is obviously the focus of this discussion, and then deal with the connectivity in terms of having one method of connectivity, or one, I'd say method of connectivity, because there's different ways we can connect, which we'll touch on in a second, but having one stream of connectivity as opposed to having duplication. If you think about it, if you look in a couple years ago, you would have had Treasury connects to a couple different banks in the US, and they might connect via FTP, they might connect via SWIFT, different choices based on the types of payments and those sorts of variables. But then you would have the ERP connecting in a different way. And there might be another organization or another department within the company that has yet another way of connecting. So what you see here is you could have multiple SWIFT connections. I've run into organizations that have multiple BICs for their organization, which, I mean, it's great, but at the same time, it's not necessarily the kind of efficiency that you're looking for, and from a cost standpoint, as well as obviously from a fraud standpoint, because if you have different ways of sending the same kind of information to the banks, those can be exploited. I mean, that's where we get into this fraud and cybercrime component, which is a whole different discussion itself, but that's what we're trying to talk about here, is standardize this, bring it into one stream, and minimize the amount of connection points that you have with the banks for efficiency and for better risk mitigation.
And just to add to that a little bit, so he talked a lot about that middle piece of being the payment hub. That is just all the different points of contact that your organization has to different banks or or different avenues. So it's the communication piece. So if you stream that into like a payment hub, you have all of those points of contact within the organization going into one payment stream, and then the outside, they're actually giving that to all your different banks. The nice thing on that, it gives a lot of visibility and control from a treasury perspective.
That's exactly right. So if we think not just from a holistic standpoint across the organization, because yes, those efficiencies are definitely there, the reduced risk is definitely there, but to be selfish from a treasury perspective, just having visibility on all of those payments is so important. And I mean, I know you do, and I know I do, run into organizations that just don't have that aggregation occurring. Right. And so Treasury is scrambling, and they have to leave idle cash in the bank to effectively have additional working capital to ensure there's enough for whatever the other part of the organization is sending out the door. And that's not what we're trying to achieve when we talk about having better visibility. That's right. We want to have complete transparency as to what the payments are, and ideally as far in advance as possible. Obviously, when we talk about standardization, aggregation, that middle part of the previous diagram, maybe some of the details that kind of get lost is this idea of, well, how do we actually make it work? It sounds grand, we're all very excited. Yes, we can aggregate everything. Yes, I want to do that. But there are some mechanics that are required. And the key thing, especially in this diagram, is that you can see there's 3 different components when we're talking about payments aggregation. When we're talking about connecting to the different banks, it's not just connectivity. Connectivity is very important. And depending on the banks that you're working with, depending on the volume of payments, depending on the type of payments, will really determine the connectivity channels that you have. Most banks have more than one way that you can connect to them. So one of my personal favorites is obviously connecting via SWIFT, and it makes sense in many instances, but it doesn't necessarily make sense in every instance. And so when you look at what you're connecting to your bank, you want to make sure, look, based on what I'm doing, which may be different than the company I talk to as a reference, based on what I'm doing, what is the right connectivity method if there are multiple choices available? SWIFT obviously spans the entire, effectively, the universe of banks that we have. It's most likely that's going to be a solution for some, if not all of the banks, but it needs to be looked at and evaluated to make sure that I'm making the best choice in terms of efficiency and cost and security, because we want to make sure we have efficiency and cost and security as the 3 different variables you evaluate. So that's the connectivity part of it. The data transformation and then the data validation are also equally important, but sometimes overlooked because we don't necessarily think about those as complex items when we're thinking in Treasury. With data transformation, the best example I can give is you think about if you're using an ERP system. So it's an SAP, it's an Oracle, it's a NetSuite, doesn't really matter what it is. Their ability, and we all know this having experienced ERP implementations, is that they're not just going to spit out an XML pane file exactly the way B of A or exactly the way HSBC or exactly the way that Bank of Kenya wants to see it. And as a result, this kind of component of data transformation comes into it. Every different bank has different formats that they'll want. And even if it's the same XML pane V2 or V3 format, there's going to be different variants of that format. I know that kind of gets complex vocabulary and you're thinking, oh my goodness, that's just really, really hard. It's not that hard, but it has to be acknowledged, the fact that there are different formats. And if you, even within the same bank, you might be sending payments from, let's just say, France to Hungary, or France to Romania, or the US to Bulgaria. It could all be XML formats, but you will have different variants. The bank will require maybe a little bit different information each time, and that's what we're talking about in this data transformation part. So it's extremely important to make sure that what's the best way to do that automatically. We want to make sure it's automatically, we want to make sure it's done right so that you obviously minimize this rejection because you didn't have the right characters in the right format and the right sequence and the right field, all these sort of technical hurdles that we really want to avoid when we're talking about sending payments. So this is a really big component. Payment aggregation tools like a payment hub will take care of this. I mean, that's one of the parts of the service. It's the connectivity to the banks, but it's also the transformation from whatever the ERP and Treasury systems would natively process and make those to what the banks need to see, no matter what the payment scenario might be. The third part of this is data validation. This didn't used to be as big a thing, but we obviously have things here in the US, such as OFAC. We have a variety of these sanctions lists, and that's one big part of the data validation. It's not the only part, but it's certainly one that we're all cognizant of. Our banks do that screening for us, and so they will, they have their lists, and they obviously have a lot of reasons to make sure that their lists are up to date, and they do that very well. There's no issues with that part of the process, but in many cases, Treasury would want to know ahead of time that the bank is going to flag something. And it could be because it's a perfectly legitimate payment, but perhaps to a country that is flagged for various different reasons. However, whyever it's flagged doesn't really matter. In Treasury, you want advance notice. You want to know that if I sent that, the bank is going to flag it, and I want to start preparing my documentation right away.
Right.
Otherwise, you risk hours or days in some cases. I won't say weeks, because I haven't seen that before, but I've seen hours and days in terms of delays, and that causes all sorts of issues. It creates reputational risk with the suppliers that perhaps you were trying to pay. It creates, obviously, a float issue because, well, that money's tied up for a certain period. So anything you can do to minimize that amount of time is extremely important. Another component around this is basically compliance checks, as well as actually validating the data itself. So validating the BIC, validating the IBAN, making sure that your payment instructions are correct, because you may have had your data transformation, the format's perfect, everything's aligned, except that maybe the IBAN number's wrong. And so as a result, there's different tools. You can have like SwiftRef as an example, which is a great online tool that you can basically bounce to validate information. There's other tools as well, but that's one that I've seen most commonly. And what that allows you to do is make sure that your payment instructions are right. Because if you don't validate this information, if you don't do that pre-screening, you definitely have potential for errors, for return payments, and obviously for things being tied up at the bank. So for me, connectivity, transformation, validation are all hugely important when we're talking about aggregating different types of payments, especially bringing in types of payments that Treasury isn't as used to seeing.
Right. So what does this mean for a Treasury practitioner, for you guys out there? So from a connectivity standpoint, when you're looking at an aggregator, it's simplifying just where that stuff's going, and it makes your life a lot easier. The data transformation, no company's in the business of doing any kind of transformation of their data for all the different payment types out there, and we're not just US-centric anymore. There are many different formats out there. So this allows you as a company not to have so many IT resources just to do data transformation. It allows you to outsource that information or that transformation piece that you're not going to have delays of payments just because you didn't tell your IT group, hey, they need another tag in this payment type now at this bank because they've made a change to this format, which is going to stop your payment completely. And then from the validation standpoint, the advance notice on that, what I've heard from my clients and from other practitioners out there, the bank is not required to give you any notification on payments that they have stopped from OFAC because they're not required to it. So you may not find out from your banking partner why they stopped the payment. So you're kind of, what do you need? How do I get this out? So this allows you to have that advance notification that you may not be getting from your bank. What do you see, and this is just around payment hub and payment aggregation, what do you see as payment growth in the marketplace today?
Well, I think one of the interesting things in the marketplace around payments, especially around aggregation, is this concept of the centralization that we talked about at the outset of this conversation. Mm-hmm. And the reason why that's important is if you just take the simple scenario, we talked about the complexities around the compliance and the payment transformation and making all the formats correct. That's difficult if you're reliant on internal IT to constantly be up to date with what those formats are. Your IT folks that are implementing and maintain your ERP, they're great people, very skilled, but they're not necessarily up to date with those formats. So every time there's a variant change, every time you create a new payment to a different country that you weren't sending to before, that puts stress on your IT resources or external consultants, depending on whom you rely upon, which delays implementation, and obviously that gets involved, it's a problem for efficiency, but it also incurs quite a bit of cost because you're not having specialized resources. So that's, when we talk about payment aggregators, that's one of the biggest services that a payment aggregator will provide. It's a big trend in terms of where's the growth. Go around the exhibit hall, you're going to see a lot of different organizations that are very willing to be able to provide those services, effectively that middleware between your multiple systems that initiate payments and the outcome in terms of the connectivity, the format transformation, the data validation. Now, some of your treasury systems, not naming names of treasury systems, I would never do that in this forum, but obviously some of your treasury systems have those capabilities as well, but there's a variety of outside opportunities. But that's a huge area that's growing more and more, especially here in the United States.
So do you see your clients or those out in the marketplace, do you see them only doing treasury payments through a payment hub, or are they doing other things like accounts payable, benefits, any other types of payments?
That's a really good question. I mean, traditionally, it's always been Treasuries. Like, I do not want responsibility for any other payments. These ACH and wires are just enough for me to worry about. But that being said, for all the reasons we talked about, we're seeing more concentration. And it's oftentimes, it's not necessarily just led by Treasury, although sometimes Treasury is proactive in that, recognizing the opportunities. Many times what we're seeing is actually the CIO or CTO or CISO or one of those C-level titles actually initiating this, recognizing that from a fraud and cybercrime standpoint, they want a policy for payments organization-wide. And it's unfortunate that's the driver for that, but it does have benefits and efficiencies that can be gained.
Can you talk about, I know you've talked about this a little, but can you expand on it a little of how this helps with control of the whole process? Like what is this providing benefit-wise for the company?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because that's probably one of the most important points. Let's start with the visibility because firstly, having control and visibility of your payments, the first part, the part that struggles out the most is visibility. I want to have visibility, not just of the actual numbers so I can fund those appropriately and more efficiently, but also visibility of the approvals, who's touched what, have there been any edits or changes to payments along that path between initiation and transmission. These are the sorts of things that I want visibility of and effectively control of. If you don't have control of your payments, you effectively risk exposures that can be exploited by either internal or external bad people. We don't want those bad agents getting involved in our payment workflows and having inconsistency, not having complete control of all of your payments, that opens up that opportunity. It creates a scenario that can be very much exploited.
So then what are some of the main challenges you're seeing your customers or clients facing right now?
The biggest one is probably awareness that this is easier than it used to be. This concept of payment hubs, I mean, we didn't really see this even 5 years ago. We used to see, look, ERP's doing their thing, Treasury's doing their thing, and we don't need to mess with each other's processes. That's starting to change. That awareness is starting to change, but that's still, it's still an education because you'll see some IT organizations, and especially ones that have invested a lot in their ERP Treasury and maybe their ERP AP modules and integrating all of them. They don't necessarily want to change anything, even though that there's options like this that can really help. So I think that's actually the biggest hurdle to overcome is just identifying where the opportunities are, showing a value. I mean, it's great to talk about efficiency, but you actually have to have an ROI that supports changing things. And so I think that's the biggest hurdle. It's the one that we've seen, and you can overcome it, but it takes an education.
So I'm glad you pulled up this one on the technology scope. So we have all of these different systems out here in an organization. You see them all on this left-hand side. How does a company support all of these numerous systems and payment types, and how does that benefit them to go to like the hub type format?
Well, I think it's actually, in the question that you asked, I think that actually pulls it out right there. It's these multiple systems, these multiple types. Anytime there's a format change, I mean, as an example, in the US, we've gone from EDI and evolving to XML payments. If you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as an example or more, or let's say you have multiple ERP systems, each of those has to be individually maintained. And individually maintained means cost, it means delays, it means all those things. Bringing them together just makes sense from a cost standpoint, but also an ability to comply with what's going on in terms of formats and compliance and all those things.
So I'm going to flip it a little bit and go to more of like the marketplace of the payment hubs and the treasury management systems out there. Do you see treasury management systems adding on that payment hub functionality? Or do you see payment hubs going to add treasury functionality, or both? What do you think is going to?
Well, I'll try to give an objective answer to that one as much as I possibly can. In my opinion, I think it's the responsibility of the treasury system to provide more payment hub capabilities. Now that being said, there are valid reasons to look at a payment hub. I just don't necessarily see those offering more treasury type functions. The biggest thing that you want integrated is you don't want payments as a standalone scenario. You want payments as part of your cash management process. You want payment part of all your data workflows. You want all that put into one system. You can, with the cloud, obviously link all sorts of different systems together more easily. But in my view, and maybe that's because I come from the treasury system world, I think it's very important, and it's responsibility of treasury to be able to provide that functionality so that you do see everything from a treasury standpoint in one spot. So I think for me, it's the first one. It's the treasury systems adding payment factory, payment hub, payment aggregation type functionalities.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bob. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a great day.